The Gila National Forest unfurls across southwestern New Mexico like a vast, breathing relic, a wilderness sculpted by eons into a labyrinth of deep canyons, towering pines, and desert scrub that clings to life with a stubborn tenacity. Its cliffs stand as sentinels, weathered and silent, their shadows stretching across a landscape that feels both timeless and alive. For the Mescalero Apache, this land is more than geography. It's a tapestry of memory, woven with stories of spirits, guardians, and things that stalk the edges of human understanding. In the fall of 2006, Coda Redbird, a man of Mescalero blood and a skeptic's mind, ventured into this expanse seeking the solace of solitude. What he encountered instead was a nightmare birthed from the marrow of legend, a confrontation with a force that turned his flashlight into a frail talisman and his rationality into a crumbling shield. This is his story, a modern descent into an ancient terror, preserved and excavated by the forbidden excavation from the shadowed folds of the Black Range. Here, the boundary between myth and reality frays like a threadbare shroud, and the air hums with the weight of what lies unseen. The lure of the wild, a skeptic's pilgrimage. Coda Redbird was no stranger to the Gila. Born and raised on the Mescalero Reservation, he'd grown up with the forest's rhythms etched into his bones. The way the wind sighed through the pines, the sharp crack of a branch underfoot, the distant yip of a coyote threading the night. At 34, he was a man grounded in the tangible. A mechanic by trade, a camper by choice, someone who trusted the heft of a wrench and the glow of a fire over the ethereal warnings of his elders. The old stories of the Stalking Antler, a spectral guardian said to roam sacred groves, its antlers twisted like gnarled roots, its claws raking the unworthy, were just that to him, stories. Cautionary fables spun to keep children from wandering too far, or to give the forest's vastness a face. He'd heard them from his grandmother, her voice low and deliberate as she stirred a pot of stew, her eyes glinting with something he'd dismissed as nostalgia. "Respect the land," she'd say, "or it'll teach you respect." He'd nod, half listening, more interested in the stew than the sermon. That skepticism armored him as he planned his trip in October 2006. The world beyond the reservation had grown loud. Too many voices, too many demands, and the Gila offered a reprieve. He'd camped there dozens of times, threading its trails with a familiarity that bordered on reverence. This time, he craved distance, a spot far from the chatter of other campers, a place where the silence could wrap around him like a second skin. He packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, a pot for chili, a hunting knife with a worn leather grip, and a flashlight whose batteries he checked twice. His truck, a battered Ford streaked with rust, carried him to a trailhead near the Black Range, a rugged spine of rock and forest that loomed over the Gila like a watchful giant. The drive was quiet, the radio off, the hum of the engine a steady companion as the pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. 6 miles in, he found his sanctuary, a clearing nestled against a sheer cliff face on one side, its surface pocked with fissures like the lines of an ancient palm. On the other, a dense wall of pines and junipers stood guard, their branches interlocking in a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sun into slivers of gold. The ground was soft with pine needles, the air sharp with their scent, a crisp, resinous tang that mingled with the faint musk of damp earth. He pitched his tent with practiced ease, its green nylon blending into the undergrowth, and built a fire, the crackle of kindling a small rebellion against the stillness. A pot of chili bubbled over the flames, its steam curling upward, carrying the warmth of cumin and smoked meat. The sun dipped low, painting the canyon walls in hues of amber and shadow, the cliffs glowing briefly before surrendering to dusk. It was perfect, a tableau of isolation that matched the quiet he'd sought. But perfection in the Gila is a fragile thing. The silence wasn't just deep, it was heavy, a presence that pressed against his ears, unbroken by the usual chorus of crickets or the rustle of small creatures. The wind, which should have stirred the pines, lay dormant, as if holding its breath. Coda noticed it as he ate, the chili's heat a fleeting comfort against the chill creeping into his bones. He chalked it up to imagination, a trick of solitude amplifying the mundane. The forest had its moods, after all. He'd felt them before. Moments when the air thickened, when the shadows seemed to linger too long. Nothing a flashlight and a good night's sleep couldn't fix. Or so he told himself. The first echoes of dread. A sound in the void. The first sign came as he stirred the chili, the spoon scraping the pot's blackened bottom. A sound, sharp, rhythmic, deliberate, pierced the stillness. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Wood striking wood, or so it seemed, the noise crisp and resonant, carried on the air like a message etched in code. It echoed off the cliffs, bouncing in a way that defied direction, as if the forest itself were playing ventriloquist. Coda froze, spoon poised, his breath catching for a moment before he exhaled a laugh. An animal, he reasoned. A deer brushing a low branch, its antlers tapping bark. Or a woodpecker, late to its work. The Gila was alive with such things, its creatures indifferent to a lone camper's fire. He resumed stirring, the chili's aroma grounding him, but the sound lingered in his mind, its precision gnawing at his calm. It wasn't random, too spaced, too intentional. He set the spoon down, wiping his hands on his jeans, and listened harder. The forest offered nothing. No chirps, no rustles, just that oppressive silence stretching taut between the knocks. An hour later, they returned, closer now, the rhythm shifting into something erratic, urgent. 3 quick taps, a stutter, then for more like a signal fraying at the edges. The cliff walls caught the sound, amplifying it, turning the clearing into an amphitheater of unease. A chill slithered up his spine, sharp and unbidden. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and scanned the tree line. Shadows pooled beneath the pines, thick and impenetrable, the fire's light a frail barrier against them. Kids, he muttered, seizing on the simplest explanation. Teenagers from a nearby town, out to spook a camper with their games. It wouldn't be the first time. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "I'm not in the mood for pranks. Go home." His voice rang out, bold and steady, but the forest swallowed it whole, leaving no echo, no reply. The silence that followed was deeper, as if his words had offended it. He sat back down, poking the fire with a stick, embers spiraling upward like tiny stars. The knocks came again, louder, insistent, reverberating through the clearing. Then, a new sound, low and guttural, a deep exhale that rolled across the night like thunder muted by distance. It was heavy, deliberate, the breath of something vast, but laced with a wet, clicking undertone that prickled his scalp. It reminded him of a bison he'd seen once at a tribal gathering, its massive chest heaving as it stood in the dust. But this was different, wrong, the clicking a mechanical stutter woven into the organic. His pulse quickened, a drumbeat against his ribs. Coda grabbed his flashlight, its weight solid in his hand, and his hunting knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. He stepped beyond the glow, the beam cutting a narrow path through the dark. The trees drank it down, their trunks swallowing the light before it could reach far. "Who's there?" he called, louder this time, his voice a tether to his fading calm. Silence answered, thick and mocking, a void that seemed to lean toward him. Then a rustle, faint but distinct, leaves shifting near the cliffs. He swung the beam that way, catching only scrub brush and jagged rocks, their edges softened by dusk. Too far in for another person, he told himself. Too purposeful for a bear or a deer. The night pressed closer, a tangible weight, and he retreated to the fire, knife clutched like a prayer. The assault begins, shadows take form. Midnight draped the clearing in a shroud of black, the fire's embers glowing faintly against the encroaching dark. The knocking had stopped, replaced by something worse, movement. Slow, deliberate steps circled the clearing, first to the west near the cliff wall, then shifting behind him into the trees. The sound was subtle, a crunch of pine needles, a snap of a twig, but it carried intent, a predator's patience. Coda stayed close to the fire, its heat a fragile shield, the knife's grip slick with sweat. He didn't want to name the fear, didn't want to give it power, but it coiled in his gut, a living thing that whispered of flight. He fed the flames, the crackle a defiance against the silence, and scanned the shadows. The steps paused, then resumed, closer now, a rhythm that mocked his heartbeat. He gripped the knife tighter, its blade a cold comfort. The first attack came without warning. A blur of motion from the tree line, a rock the size of his fist hurtling through the air. It struck the ground inches from the fire, a dull thud that sent embers scattering. He spun, flashlight sweeping the dark, the beam trembling in his grip. Nothing. The shadows held their breath. Another rock followed, faster, tearing through his tent with a vicious rip that echoed like a gunshot. Fabric flapped in the breeze, a wound in his sanctuary. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm in his ears, drowning out the forest silence. A third rock hit him square in the back, a hammer blow that drove the air from his lungs. Pain bloomed, sharp and hot, and he dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground. He scrambled for it, fingers clawing dirt, and swung it toward the trees, desperate for a glimpse. That's when he saw it. The stalking antler revealed, a creature beyond reason. It stood on two legs, a silhouette against the pines, tall and gangly, a grotesque distortion of nature's design. Its skin was pale and taut, stretched over a frame that seemed cobbled from mismatched bones. Too long here, too thin there, a body assembled in haste by some cruel hand. The head was elongated, antlers sprouting unevenly like twisted branches, their tips jagged and asymmetrical, catching the flashlight's beam in a glint of bone white. Its torso heaved with each breath, ribs stark beneath the flesh, a cage of hunger barely contained. The arms, impossibly long, ending in clawed hands that dangled near its knees, twitched with a predator's restraint. The claws curved and blackened, gleaming like obsidian. For a split second, it stared at him, eyes glinting in the light, deep, unblinking pools that held no warmth, no recognition, only an ancient, implacable will. The breath came again, that guttural exhale, wet and clicking, a sound that burrowed into his skull and nested there. It wasn't a deer, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything he could name. It was wrong, a violation of the natural order, a thing that belonged to the stories he'd dismissed. Yet here it stood, real and undeniable. Panic seized him, primal and raw. He hurled the flashlight, a desperate act, the metal striking the creature square in the chest. It stumbled back, a flinch of surprise, and emitted that clicking sound again, louder, sharper, a mechanical rasp that clawed at his sanity. He didn't wait to see its next move. Grabbing his knife, he bolted for the cliff wall, where a narrow path snaked upward, a lifeline etched in stone. His legs burned as he climbed, rocks biting into his palms, every muscle screaming for speed. Behind him, the thing followed, its claws scraping against the cliff, a grating screech that matched the wet huff of its breath. He risked a glance back, a mistake that nearly cost him. It climbed after him, movements smooth and serpentine, its limbs bending in ways no animals should. The antlers tilted as it moved, catching moonlight in a jagged dance, and its speed, its speed, closed the gap with terrifying ease. The cliff's top loomed, a plateau of rock and scrub, and he hauled himself up, lungs burning, the knife a pitiful weight in his hand. There was nowhere left to run. The fight for survival, blade against nightmare. The creature lunged, claws slashing through the air, catching his jacket in a spray of torn fabric and skin. Pain flared, a searing line across his shoulder, blood warm against the chill of the night. He slashed back, the blade sinking into its arm, a shallow cut that drew a scream, part roar, part shriek, a sound that split the air and made his ears ring. It recoiled, clutching the wound, dark ichor seeping between its claws, glistening in the moonlight. The next moments were chaos, a blur of motion and terror. Coda swung wildly, the knife an extension of his will, keeping the thing at bay. Its antlers loomed, a crown of menace, catching the light as it circled him. The ground was uneven, rocks shifting beneath his boots, threatening to betray him. It charged again, faster, claws outstretched, and he sidestepped, driving the blade into its side. The shriek that followed was deafening, a sound that seemed to shake the cliff itself, its pitch piercing his skull like a needle. The creature stumbled, movements jerky and faltering, its breath ragged, that wet clicking now a stutter of pain. It was enough. Coda turned and sprinted for the trail, legs pumping, the forest a tunnel of shadow and branch. Behind him, the thing crashed through the brush, its pursuit slower now, hampered by the wounds. He didn't look back, didn't dare. The trail stretched endless, a lifeline to his truck, every step a prayer against the darkness. The sounds faded, the crashing, the clicking, until only his own ragged breathing filled the night. He reached the truck, threw himself inside, and locked the doors, hands trembling as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared, a mechanical howl, and he sped down the dirt road, gravel spitting beneath the tires, the rearview mirror a temptation he refused to heed. The escape and the aftermath, evidence in the ruins. The drive to town was a haze, the road unspooling like a dream he couldn't wake from. At the first gas station, he pulled under the harsh fluorescent lights, their glare a stark contrast to the forest's gloom. His hands shook as he dialed 911, the receiver slick with sweat. The dispatcher's voice was calm, clinical, pressing for details he couldn't fully give. "Something attacked me," he said, voice hoarse. "An animal." He left it there, unable to shape the truth into words they'd believe. They promised to send someone, a hollow assurance. Sleep eluded him that night, the gas stations hum a frail shield against memory. The next day he returned, armed with a rifle, its weight a cold comfort. The clearing was a battlefield. Tent shredded, its poles bent like broken bones. Fire pits scattered, embers cold and gray. Blood staining the ground where he'd fought, dark and sticky against the dirt. The knife lay where he'd dropped it, blade bent at an unnatural angle, as if it had struck something harder than flesh. Gouges scarred the cliff wall, deep and furious, claw marks that spoke of frustration or rage. He followed his escape route, rifle ready, the path a scar of trampled brush and snapped twigs. Near the cliff's top, he found a cave, a shallow hollow in the rock, its mouth yawning like a wound. Inside, bones piled haphazardly, deer, rabbits, their marrow picked clean, and then human. Skulls cracked and yellowed, femurs snapped, ribs scattered like kindling, mingled with scraps of clothing, denim, flannel, a pair of boots crusted with mud. A rusted belt buckle caught his eye, engraved with JT, a silent epitaph to someone lost. His stomach churned, bile rising, but he cataloged it all, a grim archaeologist of his own terror. He reported it to the authorities, omitting the creature, letting them build their own narrative. The official story? Missing hikers, animal attacks, a tragedy smoothed into bureaucracy. He knew better. Echoes of the past, legends unearthed. Back home, Coda couldn't let it rest. The scars on his back, jagged lines that itched as they healed, demanded answers. He turned to the stories he'd once dismissed, digging through memory and tribal lore. The mescalero spoke of the Stalking Antler, a guardian of sacred land, its antlers a crown of judgment, its claws a sentence for trespassers. It was a tale for children, a warning wrapped in myth, but the bent knife in his glove box, the blood on his hands, they were no fable. He spoke to elders, their voices soft with age, their eyes sharp with knowing. "The land remembers," one said, her gnarled hands tracing patterns in the air. "It keeps what it claims." The trail near Black Range was closed soon after, signs citing dangerous wildlife activity. The bones, the clothes, the buckle, they vanished into reports, buried under layers of official silence. Coda avoided the Gila after that, its call muted by memory, but questions gnawed at him. What was it? A spirit given form, a creature forged by time, or something else? Something older, patient, waiting in the shadows of a forest that never forgets? A tapestry of terror, threads across the land. Coda's nightmare wasn't an anomaly. Across North America, Others have brushed against the abyss, their stories echoing his dread in a chorus of terror. In 2004, Elias Redhawk, a Blackfoot surveyor, met a silent stalker in Alberta's Porcupine Hills. A hulking thing with a canine snout and a hum that vibrated in his chest, leaving his assistant's body mangled among bones. In 1997, Everett Redhawk, a mescalero guide, faced the Chizos lurker in Texas Big Bend, a reptilian horror with leathery skin, its jaws shredding tourists in a canyon's shadows. Elias Whitecloud, in 2007, fled a rougarou near Michigan's Manistee River, its claws raking trees, its stench a miasma of rot. David, a Choctaw forager, outran the Nalusophilia in Arkansas's Ouachita Forest in 2012, its pale form dragging bodies into the dark, symbols of ancient warning carved in a rotting cabin. Daniel Red Elk, a Penobscot guide, escaped a shadow beast in Maine's Mount Katahdin in 2013, its vengeance swift, its claws snapping a rifle like a twig. Nathan Clearwater, a Creek boatman, battled a rougarou in Georgia's Okefenokee Swamp in 1987, its matted fur slick with mud, its jaws inches from his flesh. Thomas Yazzie, a Navajo scout, outwitted the stone drummer in Idaho's Sawtooth Wilderness in 2012, its clicking rocks a death knell, its tall frame a specter of sacred wrath. Toma Greywolf, a Muskogee guide, survived a moss-clad nightmare in the same swamp in 2013, its eel-like maw a vision of terror, its claws flipping boats like toys. Eli Deerhorn, an Osage tracker, faced a rougarou in Arkansas in 2006, its gashes carving a friend's life into the forest floor. Each encounter is a thread in a tapestry of dread, woven from folklore and blood. The creatures differ, antlered, canine, reptilian, moss-draped, but their hunger binds them. They guard, they stalk, they punish. Are they one entity, shifting across the land like a restless spirit? Or a legion, each tethered to its domain, born from the earth's deep memory? The evidence: bones piled in caves, gouges in stone, blood-soaking soil, mounts like a pyre, waiting for the flame of understanding. The weight of the unknown, a reflection. What pulls us to these tales? Is it the thrill of the void, the shiver of knowing something watches from beyond the fire's glow? Coda Redbird's night in the Gila wasn't just a brush with death. It was a plunge into a world older than the cliffs, a realm where our rules dissolve like mist. The Stalking Antler, the Silent Stalker, the rougarou, their names for the unnameable, echoes of a past we've buried but can't escape. They linger in the spaces we've abandoned, the wilds we've tamed only in our minds. Their presence a reminder that nature isn't ours to conquer. So, reader, consider this. Could you stand alone in the Gila, the knocks echoing in the dark, and hold your ground? Would you chase the truth through those woods, past the bones and blood, or let it sleep in the shadows? The forest waits, vast and patient, its secrets clawing at the edges of our world. The forbidden excavation has unearthed this story, laid it bare like a skeleton in the dirt. But the choice is yours. Step into the night or cling to the light.